Hello.
Hi.
Great energy.
I guess, we've just had a wonderful introduction, but, why are two fashion entrepreneurs sitting in a climate conference? It's not two conversations that usually go hand in hand, but, to set the scene, I guess when we talk about climate change, we talk about, fossil fuels, industrial agriculture, aviation, transportation. But the truth is, this is exactly where your fashion comes from. And to set the scene in terms of scale, because it means that fashion is one of the biggest contributors to climate change, 100 billion items of clothing are made every single year, and 3 out of 5 end up in landfill within the first year of purchase. And it's set to increase by 63% by 2030.
And just a really tangible, understandable stat around fashion waste is that every single second, the equivalent of a truckload of clothing gets incinerated or goes to landfill. And, actually lorry in England. I'm English. But if you think about that in a whole day, that's 86,000 lorries of clothing waste going to landfill every single day. So it's a huge issue. And ultimately, we're kind of hopefully part of the solution. But today we kind of want to talk about the whole life cycle. And Amy, as a fashion designer, she's been looking at fiber to finished garment and been looking at the whole life cycle and process of clothing. So do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So basically, let's talk raw materials first. People don't talk about this in fashion because we're always at the kind of glitzy part of it. But fashion comes from raw materials. So we're talking polyester is fossil fuels. It's the same fuel you put in your car. Cotton is from industrial agriculture, so it's no different than all the problems we have in agriculture. Viscose is basically trees, so we talk about deforestation, we know what's going on with the Amazon, etc. You can put clothing into that barrel too. And then we talk about wool, we talk about leather, we just need to also talk about the meat industry. And these are all the big hard-hitting things we talk about in climate space. That's exactly where your fashion is coming from. And given the fact that we throw things away so quickly, it seems insane given that fossil fuels were made pre-dinosaur and we make them and throw them away within 1 year of its life. That's kind of raw materials. And then from raw materials, we end up spinning, weaving, dye and finish. We need to get into the garments that we have today. And that just is a very complex global situation. So the average garment is about sort of 5 different stages in the process. But that's kind of quite a simplistic one. If we talk about quite a complex one with lots of linings and trims, we can double that, quadruple that. And so therefore, your garments you're wearing today could be better travel than you are, and your wardrobe, I'm sure, is better travel than, not yours. Everybody's wardrobe is better traveled than anybody. And so given the scale and given all the complexities along the way, we have to kind of think about what does that do to planet and what does that do to people. So from the planet stage, we have to think about shipping, packaging, shipping, packaging, which is between every single stage. That's just more fossil fuels, more trees. Then we think about all the chemicals, the dyes, the finishes, the washing. It's just continued pollution along the way. Then you think about all the factories that make all these garments. They need heating, they need power. So it's just more fossil fuels. So the supply chain, and this doesn't just relate to fashion, this is supply chains in general. We are talking about an extensive use of energy. And of course, we can't talk about planet without talking about people. So fashion employs 3.4 million people. Most of those are women, and only 2% of those are paid a living wage. And so in fashion, we love to talk about feminism and equality. It's hot topics in our industry. And so if this isn't a feminist or an inequality issue, then I don't know what it is.
I was going to say, I actually got into climate through the feminist lens and got into sustainable fashion through the feminist lens because I was very much there being love women, supporting women, but then realizing that you're buying into a system that is built on the exploitation of women.
Absolutely. And then maybe you can talk a little bit then about kind of what happens from the garment to the kind of the next level, the waste, element. And actually, there's lots of inequalities
there as well. There's just a lot of inequality.
Well.
No, but actually on the women lens as well, the way that we're marketed this clothing, it's made in, unjust ways with unethical practices, with so many negative environmental impact. And I don't want to be all doom and gloom here, but then it's marketed to us and we're sold joy. We're sold this really opaque industry where we're just sold more and more and more. And there's everywhere you look, there's a push for buying and a push for more. And ultimately, it's because we're part of a system of growth. And I personally, I mean, we're not wagging fingers here at People, because I personally was an avid consumer. And I grew up as part of the Gen Z fast fashion generation, where they're telling you, if you buy this dress, you'll be so much happier. And ultimately, we don't understand the impact of what that polyester dress that you're buying is, and the fact that it's taken, you know, however many millions of years to be created out of the fossil fuels to then be given to you for one wear. And it just feels so wrong that something that has taken so much then gets used one time and then gets discarded, and we never think about it again. And ultimately, the way that I am trying to think about clothing is looking at the whole life cycle of it. What has it taken for it to get there to you? And what happens after you have said goodbye to it in a really nonchalant way? And so leading on from that, I spoke earlier about the waste and the truckload of clothes. But the question is, where are they going? Like, that's a lot. Those 86,000 lorries, like, that's a lot of clothes. Where are they going? We're creating that waste. And the answer is, a lot of the time, to the shores of countries in the global south, really predominantly Ghana. And actually, to the shores of Ghana arrives 15 million items every single week. And immediately 40% of those go to landfill. So how I want to contextualize this for you guys is an understanding that that is part of waste colonialism, something where we are creating all this waste and then we're not paying for it and we're not dealing with it correctly. And instead we're saying someone else can deal with it. And that is not a system that can exist in a just world and in a fair world, both from a social and environmental perspective, because those clothes, especially polyester, they can take up to 200 years to decompose. And there's a specific landfill there that was meant to take 25 years to fill up. And it said that it was filled up within 6. Wow. And we are just nonchalantly sending it there. And I think that one thing that's also really important is to understand that the people in those communities, they are bringing so much innovation to deal with the problem that we've put onto their doorstep. And it's been incredible to see in terms of the innovation around repair. And I personally have a repair startup, and repair, upcycling, recycling, they've created machines out of scrap metal. And yet, when it comes to then investing in solutions and people, often that investment looks to Europe, which is also an injustice. I mean, there's a lot of injustice going on in the world, but that's such an injustice. And I personally have received funding for my own startup, which is obviously trying to bring more circularity to fashion, but equally a lot of startup funding goes to recycling startups in Europe, as opposed to the people who've been dealing with our waste management on the front lines for free. Like, we're not paying for them to deal with that waste. And then when we do want to fund solutions, we're not looking to those people, which is an injustice in and of itself.
I think it's also important to say that these people don't want our waste. You know, haven't got an industry that we're supplying. It's that they're coming up with solutions because we're just giving it to them. And they also have their own cultures and communities. You know, they have their own fashion. You know, they don't want our seconds. They want their own industry. So, you know, it's an injustice in the fact that we're just assuming that we can, you know, we can do that. And also there's another thing to mention, more doom and gloom, but there is, that's all we're here to deliver. There is a landfill in Chile, which is made up mostly of unsold and unused clothing. And it kind of went viral recently on social because it can be seen from space now. So that kind of gives you the extent. And also polyester is actually not re-recyclable currently. People are working on the tech and innovation, but it's not, once you've turned it into fibre, you can't actually return that back into fibre. So, you know, a lot of these problems are, you know, they still don't have a solution to them.
But I think it is important to talk about solutions.
Yes.
Isn't that why we're here? I do feel like we definitely have to speak about what is exciting, what is different, and what is worth changing. And from my perspective, especially with Sojo and what we're doing in terms of making repair and tailoring mainstream, is there is a future in which we're reimagining how we engage with clothing. And circularity being a really key part of that. Essentially, what we're believing is that it shouldn't just be make, use, waste in this linear model of existing. And actually, we need to rethink and reimagine what that can look like.
Absolutely. And obviously, you're working on, you know, the bolt-on for companies. We actually worked together on that project where obviously I design something and make something, but you're offering a solution to people. But I think what I've truly realized on this whole journey is, you know, that is one part of circularity that we need to look at. But actually what we need to do is just reinvent the entire system. And that isn't just in fashion, that's in any supply chain system. Because what we're doing is just it's take, make, use, lose, right? And we're just taking it every single stage. So when we go back to that supply chain kind of lens and we see taking the raw material, you know, spinning, weaving, dyeing, finishing, all we're doing is taking and abusing every stage. At every stage. And I think the reinvention and the solution is that kind of re-looking at all those stages and regenerating at each stage. So, if you're going to, take cotton, for instance, and grow a crop, can you actually do it biodynamically and, rejuvenate the soil and give the soil its health back to help suck, the carbon out of the atmosphere? If you're using factories, can you use renewable energies at those points? What chemicals are using? How can you have a closed loop system and kind of repurpose the water? So I think it's really important that we just need to deconstruct the way we look at everything.
Exactly. I feel like what we're trying to push is really radical in that it's not necessarily a one startup solution about repair that's working with brands to enable them to offer repairs to their customers. It is everything. It is every part. And I think there needs to just be this communal push and brave, kind of step in terms of changing things in a really fundamental way, changing things from the ground up. But where that's important in terms of the consumer push is ultimately we cannot rely on the governments for making this change. I mean, we can push as much as we want, and it will be fantastic when legislative change comes. But ultimately, we are drivers and we have power as people who are choosing what to spend, choosing what to waste, choosing what to invest in. And I think that ultimately that kind of drive and that push and that radical approach needs to come from all of us.
Yeah, and so in the sort of legislative world, we are working on it. There is a push for that. We know that needs to happen. There is the New York Fashion Act happening in America. We've got the EU legislation coming through now. The great thing about it being global is any of these legislations that do come into act, we have to adopt them because all the brands market and sell and, produce in all these different countries. So whatever happens anywhere, any improvement anywhere will actually have a big knock-on effect.
And there's legislation coming into effect in California as well that is really kind of like penalizing revenue based on how much waste a brand is creating. And I think that's the kind of actions that are really exciting, because also one thing that I do say is imagine if the waste that was created from each of these brands arrives on the doorstep of their companies, like of their actual HQs on a weekly basis, and they have to deal with it. I think there's something really, I don't know, it's so, you're out of touch of the waste that you create and you don't understand what it actually is or where it actually goes or who deals with it. And there's something so important and powerful for legislation to say you need to understand what waste you're creating and what impact that has on you.
Should we think about a couple of takeaways for everyone? Because so a few things that I just would love to, I guess, be a bit of a think tank going forward is, given everything we just said, what is the true cost of your clothing? And, we're taught that that's very cheap in fast fashion, but that if we looked at true living wages and the true planetary effect that was being had, what is the actual cost of your garment? Because it wouldn't be that cheap. So you need to ask yourself when you see very cheap clothes, what has happened to the making of this? Also, what's the true age of your clothing? I think it's such an under-discussed topic that polyester, dates back to pre-dinosaur. I just think it's something that we need to think about when throwing your garments in the bin. And therefore, what is the true value of your clothing? Knowing all that information, what does your clothes, I guess, now mean to you?
I think one thing that I'd really want to emphasize is that actually we've spoken a lot about all the stats and a lot about all the negativity and a lot about how bad it is. And I think the reason we've done that is because it's actually not spoken about enough and people don't know about it enough. And actually, especially in climate spaces, as we were saying, fashion isn't at the forefront of that, despite being such a big polluter in this planet. But I really want to emphasize the joy aspect of different ways of engaging with clothing and the fact that when you do slow down consumption, you actually have the space to find joy outside of materialism. And I know it's super easy to say, it's definitely been a journey that I've gone on in a really slow way, but I just think I really want people to question how much do we actually need and how much do you need to buy and how much do you need to be sold and are you able to take agency of that yourself? And I think the analogy that I spoke to earlier of the clothes arriving to the brand's doorstep, I'd really also like us to think about that for us as individuals as well, and all the clothes you've ever bought sort of sitting there in your garden amongst all the waste you've ever created. So that bin you take out on a kind of weekly basis. I think as we were speaking earlier about the circular economy, I really love to imagine a world in which waste doesn't even exist at all, and it's actually really archaic. And you think about landfills and you think, how ridiculous was that? We're just piling on all this trash and not doing anything with these materials. So I think on an individual level, I just want us to think about our own mini landfills and our own clothes that we're throwing away that are going somewhere on a beach, in some water, unsold, unused, in the desert. Imagine that in your garden with the waste that you're creating and try and think about, slowing things down a little bit. But thank you for listening to us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.